It began not with war but with paper, a promise printed in green ink that would one day rule the world. The US dollar didn't just become a currency, it became a weapon, a symbol, and a silent empire that conquered without armies. But its power wasn't built overnight. It was built through crisis, opportunity, and a world desperate for stability. In 1944, as World War II neared its end, the global economy was in ruins. Nations were bankrupt, currencies worthless, gold reserves depleted. In a small town called Bretton Woods, delegates from 44 countries gathered to rebuild the financial world. Their solution was revolutionary and dangerous. They decided that every major currency would be tied to the US dollar, and the dollar itself would be backed by gold. America held most of the world's gold after the war, so trust came easily. The system gave the United States unimaginable leverage. It didn't just print money, it printed influence. In the years that followed, the world rebuilt using American dollars. Factories in Germany, roads in France, trade across Asia, all financed through dollars circulating like lifeblood through the veins of global commerce. The United States became both the world's banker and its creditor. If you wanted to trade, you needed dollars. If you wanted to borrow, you borrowed in dollars, and for 2 decades that system worked, until America itself broke its own rules. By the 1960s, the US was spending more than it earned. The Vietnam War, social programs, and consumer booms drained its reserves. Foreign governments began demanding gold in exchange for their dollars, as the Bretton Woods Agreement allowed. But there wasn't enough gold left to match the paper America had printed. President Richard Nixon faced an impossible choice: honor the promise or preserve the power. In 1971, he chose power. With one announcement, Nixon closed the gold window. The dollar was no longer backed by gold, it was backed by faith and by America's dominance. The world was shocked. A currency that had been the symbol of stability suddenly floated freely. Many expected the dollar to collapse. Instead, something remarkable happened. Rather than abandoning the dollar, the world clung to it. Why? Because there was no alternative. Europe was rebuilding. Asia was emerging. The Soviet Union had no trust. The US dollar remained the anchor, not because it was perfect, but because it was powerful. But faith alone wouldn't have kept the dollar king. A new arrangement was quietly made, one that would tie the world's most valuable resource to America's paper. In 1974, a secret deal was struck between the United States and Saudi Arabia. In exchange for American protection, the Saudis agreed to sell oil exclusively in dollars. Every nation that needed oil now needed US currency, and with that, the petrodollar was born. The petrodollar system gave the US an advantage no empire had ever known. While other countries had to earn or borrow dollars, America could simply print them. Oil demand ensured a constant global appetite for the dollar, allowing the US to run massive deficits without consequence. It was a masterpiece of economic engineering, invisible, elegant, and absolute. America didn't need to occupy nations, it could control them through currency. As the 1980s and 1990s unfolded, the dollar's reach became global law. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank, both dominated by the US, lent dollars to struggling nations, often in exchange for policies that aligned with American interests. Debt became diplomacy. A country that borrowed in dollars also borrowed its dependence. When crises hit, from Latin America's debt collapse in the 80s to Asia's financial meltdown in the 90s, the same pattern emerged. Money flowed in easily, but when it left, it took sovereignty with it. The dollar wasn't just the world's currency, it was its leash, and yet no one dared to break free. To trade, to invest, to borrow, you needed dollars. Central banks stockpiled them, companies priced in them, and governments measured their success through them. Even when the United States went into debt, the world still bought US Treasury bonds, trusting that America's promise was safer than anyone else's wealth. By the dawn of the 21st century, the empire of debt was complete. Every financial transaction, from crude oil to smartphones, passed in some way through the US dollar. Wars could be funded with the press of a button. Sanctions could cripple nations without firing a single shot. It was economic warfare disguised as global order. The US had discovered something extraordinary: the power to rule without conquering. But every empire built on trust carries the seeds of its own undoing. As debt soared past trillions, questions began to surface. How long could the world's confidence last? And what happens when belief in the dollar begins to fade? For decades, the dollar's strength seemed unbreakable. Even when recessions hit, even when markets crashed, the world ran back to the dollar for safety. But power built on faith can waver the moment people start asking questions. In 2008, the world watched in disbelief as America's own financial system collapsed under the weight of its excesses. Banks that had preached fiscal discipline were exposed as gamblers. Trillions vanished overnight. The epicenter of the global economy, Wall Street, had infected the entire planet with toxic debt. And yet, as the dust settled, the unthinkable happened again. The dollar didn't fall, it rose. Investors around the world fled to the very currency that caused the crisis. Because even in chaos, the US dollar remained the safest harbor in a storm it created. It was the ultimate paradox. America could make mistakes that would ruin other nations and still come out stronger. That's when the world truly realized the dollar wasn't just a currency, it was gravity. But gravity can't be escaped forever. As the 21st century unfolded, a quiet rebellion began. China, Russia, and later the BRICS nations, Brazil, India, South Africa, started looking for ways to trade outside the dollar system. They saw what sanctions could do. They watched countries like Iran and Venezuela cut off from the global banking network overnight. And they understood a painful truth: whoever controls the dollar controls the world. China began signing oil deals in yuan. Russia shifted its reserves away from US Treasury bonds. The BRICS bloc discussed creating a new reserve currency, one not tied to Washington's whims. And digital alternatives, from cryptocurrencies to central bank digital money, began to rise, promising freedom from the dollar's shadow. For the first time since 1944, America's financial supremacy faced a serious challenge. Still, the dollar endured. Even as its rivals grew louder, its influence remained unmatched. 80% of global trade was still settled in dollars. Central banks continued to hold it as their reserve of choice. And every major financial crisis, from Europe's debt meltdown to the pandemic collapse, only made investors run back to the greenback. The empire of debt was wounded, perhaps, but not dethroned. Yet beneath that resilience lies unease. America's national debt now exceeds anything in human history. The country spends more than it earns, year after year, trusting that the rest of the world will keep lending. It is a delicate bargain, one built on the assumption that faith in the dollar will never fade. But faith is fragile, and history has shown that no empire, financial or military, can defy time forever. Around the world, whispers grow louder. What happens if the next global shock pushes investors to look elsewhere? What if digital currencies or regional trade blocs succeed in creating a true alternative? The collapse wouldn't happen overnight. It would be slow, silent, almost invisible, until one day the world wakes up to a new order. Perhaps the future won't be ruled by one currency at all, but by many, a fragmented system where power is shared, not centralized. But if that future comes, it will mark the end of something extraordinary, a century where one nation financed its dominance by printing promises. The dollar allowed America to wage wars without raising taxes, to borrow endlessly without consequence, to shape world politics without occupation. It was the softest form of control, persuasive, invisible, profitable. The empire of debt didn't conquer through blood. It conquered through belief. Still, even empires built on trust must reckon with truth. If the rest of the world no longer believes in the promise of the dollar, what will replace it? Gold, crypto, the yuan, or something entirely new? Perhaps the answer isn't a currency at all, but a lesson. That power which depends on debt cannot last forever. As nations search for balance, the story of the dollar remains both a triumph and a warning. A triumph of vision, how one country turned paper into power, and a warning that no system, no matter how mighty, is immune to its own excess. The empire of debt still stands for now. Its notes still flow through every trade, every bank, every promise of value. But the question lingers, like a shadow behind every printed bill. How long can the world believe in an empire built on credit? And when the belief fades, what comes next? Because in the end, the most powerful empire in history might not fall to war or revolution, but to the quiet sound of confidence fading away.